Steve Jobs is a masterclass in direction, acting, editing, and writing. It tries to take a closer look at the life of a public figure and shows the private side of him to the audience and succeeds in doing so near perfectly. There's a lot that this film offers in terms of discussion, philosophy, morality, and ethics. You can even look at it from a business perspective. But where I want to take a closer look at this movie today is actually a combination of all of these elements. At this point, I'm going to issue you my spoiler warning, so make sure that you have seen the movie before watching this video. I'd also like to clarify that I am only looking at the character from the movie, not the real man. Without further ado, let's take a closer look at Steve Jobs. In particular, I want to take a closer look at a scene, an interaction between Steve Jobs and Andy.
Which one?
Hertzfeld.
This scene in particular really ties the narrative together. The film uses a 3-act structure to tell that story. Although that may seem standard, what is unique about this is the amount of time in between each of these acts. All 3 lead up to an important press conference and center around 5 different relationships that Steve has. One with Joanna, one with Steve Wozniak, one with John Scully, and one with Andy Hertzfeld. And finally, and most importantly, the one about his relationship with his daughter, Lisa. I want to mention a technique that is used throughout this entire movie, and that is a visual exposition. Let me explain. This is one of the fastest paced movies out there. Danny Boyle called it an action movie with words. It's a fast paced movie with non-stop dialogue. In order to prepare you for the next scene, the film's editor, Elliot Graham, will use a visual cue to try and prepare the audience. For example, in this scene when we see Steve and Joanna talking, we actually see an edit of Lisa and Chrisanne walking up to meet with Steve. Small things like this are found throughout the entire movie, and that makes it much easier for the audience to digest. Before we go through and look at the one scene, let's take a closer look and spend a minute looking at my interpretation of the different events that happen. Above all else, what the first section shows is that Steve Jobs wanted to be successful, to have his name out there, and to have his vision become a reality. This part of the movie takes place in 1984, yet his vision remains almost identical to what we saw his company turn into in the 1998 segment. He stays true to what he wants in the business world, but where his goals change are with his daughter. That is what I want to take a closer look at in this part, because it's really the main part of the entire movie. In the 1988 section, Steve's business priorities shift to revenge. He wants to get back at Apple for letting him go when he feels like he built the company. In both the first and second acts, he feels like his vision is the only way to succeed, that nobody understands how to run the company except for him, and it has to be his way. However, this is severely contrasted with his interactions with his daughter. While he spends time with his daughter for the first time ever, he is willing to accept new ideas. She is enlightening him. Steve feels like Lisa is someone special, not because he is her father, but because there is more to her than there is with most kids. And he's probably right, she's obviously very smart. But it seems like the core of the relationship should actually stem from a paternal love for her. But instead, the opposite is true. He is willing to care for her because she is someone special. Because of this, he sees her as something that is just part of a business, and begins to treat her as such. In 1998, instead of wanting to pay for her Harvard education, he would rather punish her because of something that her mother did. This creates a parallel to when he threatens Andy earlier in the film. So Andy decides to pay for Lisa's education. This makes Steve furious, and for the first time in the entire movie, Andy stands up to him, and this causes Steve to realize that there's a whole lot more going on, and that he may not always be right. Now this is the scene that I want to take a closer look at, because I think that's the best in the entire movie. What Boyle does with blocking cinematography and editing is truly fantastic. Now it begins in a relatively standard way, with one over-the-shot shoulder to another. But let's take a closer look at the background. Behind Andy is a door. This signifies that he has an escape route, that he can go at any point. He has been working at Apple long enough that he could end his entire career. Instead, he chooses to stand up to Steve to protect someone for whom he cares, Lisa. But behind Steve is a picture of a misty forest. Now generally what this means in literature is of mystery, and more often than not the development of youth. This can be seen in countless fairy tales, folklore, classic stories, and even some contemporary films. I take this to mean that Steve is standing in the way of Lisa's development, and if you listen to the dialogue, that is what Andy is saying. This means that the camera is taking Andy's side. For the first time in the entire movie, we're not taking the perspective of Steve. In addition, the room is full of mirrors, which represents self-reflection, which is a big theme in this scene. However, despite that, Steve still intimidates Andy, yet Andy still stands up to him. Now this shot shows a whole lot. Steve is much taller than Andy, but Steve is blurry, almost out of focus, while Andy is clear. The over-the-shot shoulders continue, only now Andy is shot from a high angle and Steve from a low. As the conversation continues, this is brought to an even higher level, as Andy sits down and Steve towers over him. Now, despite it appearing like Steve is actually winning the conversation, his biggest opponent is himself, as he essentially accuses himself of being a bad father, and Andy agrees. This is the first time in the entire movie when he realizes that he is wrong. He can't lash out at himself, he can only accept it. He realizes that there is more than one way to do things, and in this case, his way was wrong. This is the most important scene in the entire movie, as Steve realizes that he is wrong and loses the argument. This scene sets him up to realize that he has been wrong throughout the entire movie and entire story. For the rest of the movie, he goes through different relationships that built his life into what it becomes, and he realizes that he is unhappy with it. This conversation shook him to his core and forever changed his character's life. By the time he does meet with his daughter, this is the closest that we are actually going to see to an apology. He tells her that he is wrong, and that's enough for her. She's able to forgive that because she knows that that is him actually reflecting, and she knows that that is honest. From here on out, his life is going to forever change because he knows that he can be wrong just like everybody else. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to encourage all of you to check out movierehab.com and tell you that next week we are going to be looking at Gone Girl. There's a whole lot that you can talk about in that movie, and I'm really excited to discuss it. As always, that'll be out next Saturday and is linked on the right of the screen. On the left of the screen is my last video when we discussed killing a character. There's a lot of really interesting conversations that I got into in that video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.